give it just a second.
All
Okay.
right.
And it's there. So you should be able to share your screen and take it away.
Right. Let me get organized here, and I will do that. There we go. Okay. I should be seeing that slide deck.
Yes.
All right, cool. And as we're getting started, love to have audience participation. So I am not seeing the chat, but at any point, if you have questions or you need clarification on something, feel free to unmute and ask, or if somebody wouldn't mind helping keep an eye on that chat for me, I'll try and answer those as much as possible as we go along. So thank you so much for having me tonight. My name is Michael Hewitt, and I'm looking forward to talking some really nerdy stuff with you guys as we demystify DAX. So to get going, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a Christian, I'm a husband, and I'm a father of 3. And I work for Hunt Brothers Pizza. I'm based out of Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm also one of the co-organizers of the Power BI user group here in Nashville. I'm a Cincinnati native. I lived there for over 20 years. So I'm a self-proclaimed Cincinnati chili connoisseur. But outside of work, you'll find me and our family volunteering at our local church. I've also been a drummer for long enough that I can't remember how many years, but we'll say close to 30 years. Feel free to connect with me on social media. Most of the data stuff that I do, you'll find on LinkedIn, and I occasionally write about things I'm learning or places that I'm speaking and data books that I'm reading on my blog at michaelhewitt.net. I've been a Power BI user pretty much from the beginning, so you'll find as we go through the night here, I kind of like talking about this stuff, so it's okay if you think I'm talking too much. If you want to just unmute and say, "Hey, that's enough. Let's move on." All right. But that is enough about me. I want to know a little bit about you all. So if you want to scan that QR code, I'd love to know, where are you all at in your current skill level with DAX? We'll give this just a minute and see. The responses should come through if everything works right. Okay. 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 All right. No DAX ninjas so far. The last time I did this presentation for the Nashville group, somebody put in that they were a DAX ninja. And I was like, I think we need to stop this presentation right now and turn it over to you, because you definitely know more about this than I do. Okay, very good. So a good chunk of the group, okay, feels pretty comfortable with DAX, I'd say. Few advanced folks out there, that's good. And a few folks who are very new to writing DAX. Okay, so we got a mix of folks here tonight. Sounds great. Well, in this talk, we're going to try and keep it fairly high level, but as we get through the presentation into some demos, perhaps we'll get a little bit deeper maybe than I planned. We'll see how that goes. But tonight, I just want to give us an overview of DAX, help kind of level set and get everybody on the same page about what DAX is, how we write it, what that syntax looks like, where we can use it, really the 5 W's of DAX, if you will. Want to do a review of context within Power BI, because that's an incredibly important part of writing DAX, is understanding and considering the context where you are writing DAX. I'll lay out a DAX learning path for you, show you some DAX resources, and then we'll actually get into Power BI and write some DAX in some different places so we can have a look at the syntax and get an understanding of how DAX works and what to do with it. So I've had the pleasure of teaching DAX in some training courses. As was mentioned a little bit ago, I've taught DAX to coworkers in some smaller one-on-one or small group settings. And a lot of times when I've got a user, particularly a fairly new user to DAX, I see a lot of facial expressions that look something like this. Say, hey, all right, we're going to start writing some formulas. It's a little bit like code, and then people are like, whoa, hold on now, Michael. I don't know about this. I'm not sure that I can handle that. Sometimes people might want to keep it just a little bit more professional in their response. So perhaps they're a little bit, less of this facial expression, a little more of the Michael Scott with the cringe. And they start to get kind of scared of writing DAX. But DAX really isn't scary. It can get complicated, but once we learn to understand how DAX works, we can start to have kind of this feeling about writing DAX. And this is really the goal. This is where we want to get you. We want that sense of accomplishment, that sense of this thing that I've been working on, this code, this measure that I've been fighting with and tweaking and refining now works. Hoist that trophy. This is a major accomplishment. And be encouraged, because this is exactly the kind of feeling that you can get once you get comfortable in DAX. You practice some, and you get going. If you ask my coworkers, they would say that I've given the touchdown many a day when the DAX finally starts working. So this is our goal. This is where we want to get you. Again, DAX isn't scary. It can be challenging, but if you can write some complex Excel formulas, I'm confident that you can learn DAX and be effective with it in your reporting. So what exactly is DAX? Well, DAX is short for Data Analysis Expressions. It's a functional language that's very similar in its syntax to Excel formulas. Now, it's not exact, and we'll see that. And for those of you who have written some DAX, okay, some of those measures look the same as Excel formulas, but once you start really interacting with them, you find, okay, they act differently. But it makes it really easy for somebody to step from Excel into Power BI and some of the other spots that we can write DAX. It makes for a nice, smooth transition. Now, where DAX is a little bit different than Excel formulas is that DAX is created specifically for working in data models. That is really a key point as you're working with DAX to remember, okay, this is this data analysis expressions language that we're working with for working in data models. So with that in mind, a lot of times people want to know, well, are there prerequisites to writing DAX? I'd say, yeah, a little bit. You don't have to be a coder, fortunately, to start writing DAX, but understanding data modeling, I think, is very important. So if you want to write good DAX, you need to also take the time to understand how to build and work with solid data models and star schemas in Power BI. Now, it can be helpful if you do know how to work with Excel formulas. Again, because some of the syntax overlaps, it does give you a bit of a head start. So if you're not an expert, or if you don't feel comfortable with data models in Power BI, I would say take some time, get to know that, and as you're getting to know those models, then you can start to write some DAX. So if you need any resources for learning data modeling or getting more comfortable with that, don't hesitate to reach out. I've got a couple of videos that I can point you towards that will help you get started with the data modeling. All right, so who should write DAX? Now, I think everybody should learn to write DAX. Anybody working in Power BI should learn to write DAX, but that might be a little bit of a simplified answer. But I am confidently going to say that everybody in this group, you should learn to write DAX. So my more professional answer would be anybody who's planning to work with data in the Microsoft BI stack should learn to write some DAX. Doesn't mean you have to become a DAX ninja or rival the Marco and Alberto, the Italians, who pretty much write every book on DAX. If you don't know who they are, look them up, Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari. You definitely want to be familiar with them. So, but it doesn't mean you have to be at their level, but you should at least be comfortable and functional with DAX in order to create great Power BI reports. So why should you learn DAX, or why should you encourage other analysts working with Microsoft BI tools to learn DAX? The reason for that is because learning DAX unlocks kind of the full potential of Power BI. So think about an Excel spreadsheet. Without writing Excel formulas, you've really kind of just got a grid that you can fill in different bits of data in. But once you start writing formulas and you start to learn how to write more advanced formulas, you really unlock the full power of Excel. DAX and Power BI, it works the same way. Once you learn to write DAX, you can do so much more with your report than just simple dragging, dropping of implicit measures. We'll look more specifically at that when we get to the demo portion here in just a little bit. So a couple more reasons why, and to demonstrate how DAX unlocks the full power of Power BI. There are over 250 DAX functions that you have to work with, and there's more being added regularly. Learning DAX gives you the ability to implement custom business logic. Any of us who have been working with an organization for any amount of time or doing this work for any amount of time know that businesses have some complex components to them that we've got to find data to bring answers to. And in the case of Power BI, learning to write DAX gives us the tool set that we need to take that business logic and implement that into a report, or at least gives us another option of places to implement that custom business logic. Okay. We can perform more complex calculations on our data. Again, anytime we're writing reports, simple math doesn't always get it done. We've got to pull out more statistics. We've got to pull out more complex things to bring the full value out of our data. DAX is going to allow us to do that. And perhaps the number one reason that I would recommend learning DAX is that you can unlock time intelligence functions. This is really the bread and butter of Power BI, is working with time intelligence. There's folks who I talk to who have worked in Tableau or other tools who say, man, Power BI's time intelligence is so much better. We can do the same calculations in other tools, but it's much more efficient to get there in Power BI start to finish. So if there's one reason that you're going to learn DAX, these time intelligence functions would be that one reason. And the last reason is that with DAX, not only can you do all these complex calculations and implement all kinds of logic and do all kinds of stuff on the aggregation side, but learning DAX actually helps you in visualizing your data and formatting your reports. You get additional options within the formatting pane of Power BI to write DAX, to give you different types of conditional formatting, and so on and so forth. So everything from aggregating your data all the way to presenting your data, DAX has a finger in that in Power BI. So where can DAX be written? Really, again, across the entire Microsoft BI stack. Primarily, when people think of DAX, though, they think Power BI. We can also work with DAX in Microsoft Fabric, particularly those semantic models that we're creating in Fabric. Power Pivot for Excel is another place that we can write DAX. And both analysis services, either run if you're running that in Azure or on a SQL server, you'll just want to make sure that that analysis service is running in tabular mode. If it is, you can write DAX there as well. So how should an analyst or how should you learn to write DAX? There's a lot of ways that you can get started with DAX. All kinds of YouTube videos, all kinds of books, courses available on the internet. But these are a couple of the resources that I recommend that you get started with. Both Microsoft's kind of official DAX documentation and function reference. It's a good one to bookmark. Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari that I mentioned earlier kind of did their version of the same DAX function reference, and it's called dax.guide. I really like this site. There's a lot of great in-depth articles about different functions, how they work, and how to apply those functions. So that's a really good one to start with. But really, any of the other SQL BI resources, they do a lot of, Marco and Alberto do a ton of blogging, training, courses. So any of the stuff that they're offering are some great ways to get started or to continue your knowledge of DAX, how it works, and different patterns and use cases for different DAX functions.
Hey,
Now, this is a
Michael.
good time to note that in my experience writing DAX and in this current age of AI, I've seen AI give some interesting DAX answers, some stuff that coworkers have pulled up some DAX, shown it to me, and I've kind of done one of these. Like that's not quite what I would have written, but okay. So I would encourage you, if you're going to use AI to help you write DAX, you still want to learn how DAX works, how DAX thinks, if you will, so that you can understand if the answers that you're getting back from AI are actually good answers or not. So just a little side note there. Kevin, did I see that you had a question?
Yeah, well, there's some stuff from the chat that I thought would be a good time to bring up. If you
Okay, sure.
back up, I think one slide.
Right.
Um, yeah, where DAX could be written. There was two comments in the chat. One was just simply DAX Studio. I don't
Yep.
think you were covering all the third-party tools, right? But DAX Studio and Tabular Editor 3, you could do it there as well.
Hmm.
And
Yep,
somebody
that's
brought
right.
up an interesting one, saying paginated reports slash SSRS reports
Yep.
also correct. And
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I
Yeah,
know
you can.
paginated reports. I don't think you could go back to the old SSRS, but if you're calling the new stuff
Mm,
paginated reports, that can connect to a semantic model.
that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. I was kind of lumping, I guess, lumping that one in with Power BI. But yeah, you're
Mm-hmm.
absolutely right. You can write DAX queries against those semantic models to pull data into paginated reports for sure.
Thanks.
Yes. And that's right. Those third-party tools do allow you to write DAX in those as well. I should add those into this slide actually. That's a good idea. Is there any other questions?
That was it. Thank you. And
Cool.
I'll try to do that. I'll raise my hand if I see something from the chat, and then
Awesome.
you could
Thank you.
stop where you need to.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay. So whatever whatever method for learning DAX that you choose, whatever tools and cater to your learning style best, probably the best way that you can learn to write DAX though is to practice. So pick that book, pick that video, pick that course. Of course, I would always recommend picking something that's reliable, but once you find something that's working for you, practice. Just practice writing DAX. Once you've practiced, practice some more. And then once you've practiced some more, find a good project that you can implement, whether that's something at work or a passion project, and practice putting that learning into action. The more you practice, the better you're going to get writing DAX. If you've learned any other programming languages or again, even Excel formulas, uh, it's the same tried and true method. The more you exercise that skill, the better you're going to get at it. So once you get started with DAX, you'll see pretty quickly that there's actually a lot of different ways that you can utilize DAX. Probably the most common is to create DAX measures. So DAX measures are flexible calculations. They can be used and reused across Power BI visuals, Excel pivot tables, really any place that a calculation can be dropped somewhere into a report canvas. You can also use DAX to create calculated columns. So that's going to apply your DAX expression or whatever DAX that you write across every row in a table. It's also possible to create what are called calculated tables. So you can write a DAX expression that adds a new table to your data model. And depending on the DAX functions that you choose to use, give you all kinds of different options for pulling together data, joining data, filtering data, so on and so forth to create the data table that you need. Um, One that can be a lot of fun, but tends to get a bit more advanced, is that you can actually use DAX as a query language. So you could write a query in DAX to pull data out of a Power BI semantic model or an SSAS model and the kind of form of, think about it almost like a temporary table. So if you've written a SQL query before, you get a result that gets returned and displayed in your tool of choice. Same thing happens if you write a DAX query. Okay, just mentioning that you can write those DAX queries to pull data into a Power BI paginated report. And the final place, and this is the newest place that you can write DAX, is actually in visual calculations. So these visual calculations are places that you can write DAX. These only exist in Power BI, but it allows you to write DAX in the context of a single Power BI visual. So it doesn't really give you a measure or something that you can reuse across multiple visuals, but if you've got some sort of calculation that you want to visualize and you only need it that one time, visual calculations can be a great place to write that DAX. Now, Couple of you, your spidey senses are probably up. You're going calculated columns, calculated tables. We couldn't talk about DAX without giving a little bit of a warning on calculated columns and calculated tables. As you get down the road with Power BI and you get down the road with DAX, you know that writing calculated columns and calculated tables is not necessarily considered best practice. There can be more efficient ways of getting new columns of data added to a table, or more efficient ways of adding new tables of data to your model. With that being said, though, it doesn't mean that you should never write a calculated column or never write a calculated table. In all transparency, we're actually going to write a calculated column in the demo. But it's use a calculated column when you need to and there's no other solution. Use a calculated table when it's most appropriate. Now we could do a long deep dive on the reasons for that and spend the next like 15 minutes talking about vertipack and compression and pushing all of this back to Power Query or back to your data warehouse or SQL or some other ways of doing that. I'll save that for another talk, but want to make sure that you understand you can do this, but only use it when you need to. I think I saw another question.
I don't see, there was just
Yeah,
a,
I spuriously raised my hand. I was trying to hit the react, and my eyes aren't so good.
Okay,
okay.
no worries. All right. So as we're writing DAX, as I mentioned in the introduction, we've got to consider the context. This is one of the most important parts of working with DAX in any of the tools that we're working with. We'll start with a pretty high level as we talk about context, and there's a couple of different contexts that I want to introduce and help us to get familiar with tonight. The first of those is being a filter context. So Marco and Alberto define a filter context as a set of filters applied to the data model before the evaluation of a DAX expression starts. So another way to think of this is, what kind of filters do we have going on in our report? DAX is going to recognize those and kind of suck those filters in to its calculation. So we'll take a look at that in our demo to help kind of cement the thought. But want you to go ahead and get familiar with that filter context. The other context is a row context. So in a row context, in order to complete an aggregation or to complete, whatever code we've written in DAX, some DAX functions need to iterate over every row in a data table. And as they're doing that iteration, it's really important that the DAX knows what row it's working on. So for DAX to know what row it's working on, that's called the row context. Again, we'll see that in action, and that's where we'll actually write a calculated column to help show you what row context is. But understanding these different contexts is important. Now, there's a lot more to context in Power BI, but again, those are conversations that go on as you get a little deeper into DAX. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about learning DAX, but I think this is a pretty good learning path for most people to follow. So tonight, we're kind of in this left column, kind of a DAX 101, starting with a high level, where we want to understand we want to make sure we understand data modeling and we get comfortable with the syntax of DAX, and we start working with some basic aggregations and understanding what those aggregations are doing and how the way our data model is set up affects whether or not these calculations give us the right answers or the wrong answers. And as well as some of the other types of kind of tools that Power BI gives us to help us write some more complex measures as we're still learning, called quick measures. We'll take a look at that in a minute. And I want to get us introduced as well tonight to calculate, kind of the Swiss Army knife, if you will, of DAX functions. From there, we can kind of move on through the different levels of DAX. 201, we start to get a little bit more complex. There's a series of functions called the iterator functions or the X functions, where row context becomes very important when working with those functions. We start to write a little bit more complex DAX and we add some variables. Once we get comfortable with that, I think 201 and 301 can almost kind of blend together. But we really start working with time intelligence functions and start thinking about year to date and month to date, and then comparing this year to date versus last year to date, or 3 years ago to date, whatever time periods are important to you, and start working with different date periods within our data. And then finally, at the 401, kind of the most advanced level, learning how to write custom time intelligence. So all of these total year to date, total month to date measures are great in Power BI. If your business is running on a standard calendar, but if you say run on a 445 fiscal calendar or some other type of non-standard calendar where your months don't line up with the typical calendar months, you got to write some custom time intelligence. At that level, you're ready to start implementing some more complex DAX patterns and working with queries and really start to think about context switching. So how do all these different types of contexts work together, and how can you write DAX to change the way context work together? You work with calculation groups, so some more advanced things. Lots of super nerdy stuff, but it's a lot of fun. Did I see another question from you, Amon?
Yeah, I mean, you have a nice comprehensive, like tiered thing here.
Mm-hmm.
Like last time I was writing DAX measures was probably when they released window functions. So
Gotcha.
did they did they fall in with like custom time intelligence, or do you see them more like an expansion of visual calculations? Like where would you put that collection of functions?
Yeah, when I'd say probably 300 or 400 level. But it does get a little blurry, though. You're right, because there can be some great use cases for those in visual calculations. But I'd probably put them down at the 300 or 400 level.
Mike, so I guess that kind of the origin of those window functions were to support those visual calcs.
Yeah.
You can use them as an alternate to time intelligence, but I think their primary purpose was to support those new calculations.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Mark. Any other questions on that learning path?
My question is, when is it that I've saw in the chat somebody mentioned about interviews, and that's true. It has happened to me. They ask you, what's the complex DAX you've written? And I know going through a training in the past, they say keep it as simple as possible. Break it down if you have to.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, it's the same thing as people asking you, do you know complex SQL, complex queries?
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand that. So where does complex fall into all this stuff if you're supposed to break it down
Mm.
in
Yeah.
201, 203, 401?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think complexity probably starts late 300 into 400. I think with DAX it can be a little bit different because at least in this learning path, I'm thinking about keeping it simple early on because I'll show you in a minute. We want to get comfortable with thinking about how we write this piece of code, how 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 it's working with our data model behind the scenes. And so we don't always get to see that happen in DAX. And so we've kind of got to visualize it and think through it. And so I like keeping it simple up front just so we get really comfortable thinking about how DAX is thinking, how it's evaluating the code that we give it to give us the response that it returns. And so it's more about kind of building on getting comfortable with the basic aggregations and the basic thinking with more complex topics after that. So I think for some people, they can look at SQL and it all makes sense and they can go really quickly with it and get to that complex stuff very quickly. Other people, a lot of folks, I think, even in analyst roles, don't necessarily think about complex SQL queries all the time because they're not necessarily doing as complicated of queries to pull data out of the system all the time. So it just, I think that's where it gets a little bit different. Mine's more just trying to help you think about what the DAX is doing. So once you get further down the road, you get really comfortable with how the DAX engine works. And once you get to the more complex topics, then you're already thinking appropriately about what's going on under the hood. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. Sure. Thank you.
Sure. Any others?
When do you apply Windows functions in DAX? I mean, if Windows function is for to work with group by over and stuff like SQL, so where do you apply it in DAX?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main use cases of that can be when you're working with visual calculations. But there are other places, but that's one of the main ones.
I think that just understanding that they're behind the scenes when you're doing a visual calc, if you get under the covers into those calculations and you need to look at the code behind it, you're going to see those Windows calculations in there. I guess having an understanding there is a good idea, but when you start talking about the performance of DAX back in the engine, you'll learn that those window functions don't take advantage of the storage engine, the efficient storage engine, like you would expect out of a calculate or a traditional measure. So I think, and I could be wrong, but I think a lot of people know that window functions are out there, but they haven't necessarily jumped from traditional calculates over to window functions for a couple of those reasons.
Yeah, I completely agree. All right, let's jump over into Power BI and we'll actually start here to write some DAX. So the first thing we want to do is, I want to talk for a second about not DAX. So we've all seen in Power BI, it's pretty much in every demo, especially all the sales demos that we see. We see folks opening up their data model, and actually let's start there. I'm just using the Contoso model that gets used in lots of different demos, very basic. We've got kind of our main sales fact table with 4 dimensions. And there's also a currency exchange table that's part of that model. We're not really going to do much with that tonight, so I guess that's kind of like a second fact table here. So we're basically focusing on these 5, the sales, with the date, store, product, and customer dimensions. And so so when we see a lot of demos of Power BI, we'll see some very basic tables put together on the canvas. Somebody will go grab some data to aggregate out of their fact table. In this case, we'll grab quantity, we'll drag and drop, and we'll get something that looks like this. So what's just happened is that we technically have created a measure here, but we've created an implicit measure. And in general, if we're going to do anything more than extremely basic Power BI reports, we want to avoid these implicit measures. Even though they can be handy for giving us very quick answers like what we just seen, if we dig in here a little bit, we'll see that we really only get a handful of aggregation options. We can do our basic sums and averages and mins and max. Can be good for a little bit of exploratory analysis, but there's no option here to give me some of the answers I need to provide to the company that I work for. And so it's a bit limiting. Also, I'll show you this a little bit more once we get into writing DAX. Once I create that implicit measure, it's a one-time use. I can't reuse this sum of quantity. If I wanted to use that in another visual, I just have to drag and drop. Again, can't really do any math on top of that implicit measure. So anytime that we're going to create reports in Power BI, we want to explicitly write DAX to create explicit measures. So to get started here, let's actually jump over into our table view. And I'm going to go to the sales table. And to show us row context and action, I'm going to create a new calculated column on this sales table. And we're going to add a column that'll show us our sales amount. So in the sales table, we know how many of a particular item was purchased, and we know what the price of that item is, but we don't necessarily have it exploded out to give us the total price across the row for a row where somebody's bought more than one of something. So that's what our column is going to help us to do. So we're going to add a sales amount calculated column, and I'm just simply going to start typing out the columns that I'm looking for. So quantity times net price. Now, for those of us who are a little newer to DAX, there's a couple things that's going on here. So I've got in the syntax here that we're writing up here in this formula bar, looks very similar to Excel. We've got the name, in this case, the name of our column, equals anything to the right of that is going to be the DAX expression that gets evaluated and aggregated in our model. So in this case, we've got two things happening here. Okay, in our syntax, what I've got highlighted here is our table. Inside the square brackets is a column. So that's just helping us to know from the sales table, grab the quantity column, multiply that by the net price column from the sales table. Now, if you remember in defining row context, we said that row context is where Power BI is going to go row by row through a table and evaluate this expression. So when I hit enter, we get a new column that gives us quantity times net price for every row in our table. Pretty easy to validate whether or not our DAX is accurate here because well, actually, all of our quantities here that are visible are 1. So we're pretty much just going to get net price. But if I get rid of those 1s, so now we got 7 times 2815. Can't do that math in my head, but I'm going to trust that that's right. 9 times 889. Okay. Yeah, okay. So our DAX there is working. So what's happened is Power BI is iterated just like we expected it to. It's iterated over every row in this table to give us this answer. So there's row context and action. Now, if I were going to build a production model, probably wouldn't leave this calculated column here. I would go into our DAX 201 and use an iterator function to write this as a measure. But for right now, I'm just going to leave that. I'm going to leave that here. So makes sense. Everybody kind of tracking so far. That is row context in its most simple form. I will say too, I also like to use calculated columns sometimes when I just want to quickly see results across a table of data. So if I'm testing something, I want to make sure the DAX I'm writing is accurate. I'll put together a calculated column because as we saw, the aggregation performed pretty quickly, so I could see almost immediately whether or not my DAX was working. Calculated columns can be really handy as you're practicing to see if the DAX you're writing is working or not. So, all right, so we've got row context now taken care of. We've got our sales amount. I want to show a little bit of filter context as well in action. So I've got this highly detailed report started here where I've got a matrix with our year on the columns. And let's write a simple DAX measure now that we can add to this matrix, and then we'll actually take a look at how Power BI is giving us the different answers for each of these years. So there's a couple different ways you can fire up writing a new measure. You can use the new measure button. I tend to right click over here in the data pane and hit new measure. Zoom in here so you guys can see that better. Very similar syntax. So we're going to give our measure a name. In this case, we're going to write a measure that shows us the total quantity from our sales table. All right, so total quantity equals, and then we'll just write a simple sum. So again, very familiar if we've been writing sums in Excel. One of the things that I'll highlight though as I'm writing this is that DAX allows us to have all kinds of white space. It allows us to format our measures. So I can put a space here in between the parentheses in my function to make this a little bit more readable. Once you get more complex, longer DAX measures, you can actually format those and tab over and all kinds of stuff to make your DAX more readable. And so really like that. It's a great tip as you learn to write more DAX. Don't be afraid to put white space in and keep it readable for yourself. You'll be glad when you write a 50 line DAX query or a really complex measure that you've done that. All right. So we've gotten our measure written. It is now in the model. And we are ready. We are ready to visualize this guy. Another tip is that you should always format your DAX measures. You can do that by clicking on the measure, selecting Measure Tools from the ribbon, and applying the appropriate formatting. So now we've gotten some different answers. So maybe not the most detailed report that we'd want to see, but let's evaluate, what's happening here in our DAX. So if we want to know how did Power BI come up with 331,195 units or items in 2024? How'd we get there? I'll pause though. Kevin, you had a question.
Yeah, somebody in the chat wanted to get into the debate about a dedicated measure table.
Ah, okay.
And I don't know what your opinion is. I know mine, but so yeah, so the question,
Yeah.
just read it, like when you create a new measure, do you create a dedicated measure table, or is it all simple preference, pros, cons to use one or the other?
Yeah, great question. I usually create a measures table. I've heard the arguments both ways. I've always felt like it has kept me more organized to have all my measures in one place. That's something that I kind of learned early on and stuck with it. But I also I see the logic of hiding all of your columns that you're aggregating out of your fact tables and putting your measures on those tables. I see the logic of that too. I've always found for myself, sometimes I end up searching a little bit longer to find those measures than if I keep them all in one place. So that's my tendency. I'm curious though, how do you typically think about it, Kevin?
I never use a measures table.
Okay.
All my fact tables are proper facts that I hide every other column.
Yep.
And then, right, so when I put the measures on there, right, so if it's store sales, those are the measures that are explicit specifically for store sales.
Mm-hmm.
And then it still shows up at the top. Now, somebody did ask, what is a measures table? What the technique is, and a lot of people use this, and I could see some benefit to it at times, but you create like an empty table or a one row table, hide the column, and then just kind of put all your measures there. And then because you have everything hidden, it only has measures. It floats up to the top of your data pane. Because that's just, and anything that is only exposing measures will always float up to your data pane, right?
Yep.
But the one main reason that I still will not use a dedicated measures table is if you're doing self-service and you're expecting people to use Excel pivot tables, the double clicking to drill down the data will not work.
Mm-hmm.
That is the one. And early in Power BI's career, there were other restrictions. So there's always a possibility a feature won't work.
Yep.
So you're saying that if the measure's not in the table itself, then you double click and those columns won't come through in the detail.
That is correct. I believe
Okay.
that's still the restriction. It still has to be on the table. That I haven't tested it lately, but that's what I remember reading last. And I haven't read that they fixed that. And I don't know that they
that's
would.
good to know. Cool. Thanks, Kevin.
I have a question about the outputs
Sure.
of measures, right?
Mhm.
I mean, the way I've been looking at it, or what we're seeing is measures are supposed to give you either a table value or a scalar value,
Mhm.
right? It has to be a value,
Yep.
not a string. But we can create measures that are text-based, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So most measures that you create are going to return a scalar value. And if you remember, measures are really flexible. So in our case here, we've got
Well,
scalar
just to
values
be
that,
clear, a measure cannot return a table.
right,
It could
that's
only
right,
return a scalar value.
that's right,
And that
that's right,
can be text, but it cannot be a table.
that's right, that's right. That's right. So in this case, because we've got a filter context of a year, we're getting a scalar value that returns here in this table visual uh, for every year. That's right. But yes, DAX can work with text, and I can show you that too in just a minute. Did that cover all of our questions?
Yeah, I think we're good to go. I know
No,
we're
I have one more. Sorry.
Okay, sure.
Arnold, you said it can only return a scalar value. What if you do something like top 10 or top 100? Is that not a table? Is it
that comes from the query, not the measure.
That's right. That's right. Yep, good answer.
Yeah, DAX could be used as he pointed out to write queries. In fact, that's what Power BI does. But the measure itself always returns a single value.
That's right.
And Kevin, I'll just add to that. You can mix them together. You can use DAX as a query language within your measure, but at the end of the day, a measure is going to return a scalar result.
Yep.
That's right. That's right. Okay.
That's
So-
why we don't say DAX is simple. Right?
Exactly. Exactly.
It's fun though.
Oh, yes. So let's jump back and look at how did we get to this value, 331, 195. This is where having that understanding of how our data model works is really important. So we know that that number returned for the year 2024. So what's happening is Power BI has grabbed that filter context and it's saying, okay, from my date table, I know I've got this year column. If I go to our date table, we can actually visualize what's happening. So imagine then that Power BI is saying, okay, I know the year is 2024. So I'm going to filter down my date dimension table to only return 2024. That filter context is going to travel through my relationship between my dimension and fact table. It's heading in from the dimension down to the fact, okay, which is indicated right here from the one to the many side of the relationship. And then that filters our fact table. Says, all right, only show me the sales that occurred in the year 2024. And then we're going to perform our aggregation, which if you remember from our measure, just is the sum of the sales quantity. So it says, all right, I got all my sales from 2024. Now sum up that quantity and we get this answer. Now we could throw some really complex filter context at this, start out in slicers and multiple dimension tables, but the same principle applies. DAX is going to, or Power BI, sorry, is going to apply those filters to our dimensions, whichever tables and fields that we have chosen. Those filters are going to flow down the relationship according to how we've built our data model, filter our fact table, and then return the results of what we've asked it to in this DAX. So if your data model ends up being a little wonky, you might get some interesting results. And that's why, because Power BI is just that model isn't built to support giving us the correct answers. We won't dive too much more into that, but I want you to really just be thinking in terms of, as we write simple DAX measures, this is how DAX thinks. We're applying our filters. Generally, those filters are probably coming from our dimensions down the relationship into our fact table. So that's the very basis kind of how the DAX engine is thinking. Now, just to demonstrate real quickly that we can use DAX to work with text. On this product table, let's say we want to concatenate our category and our subcategory. I'm going to name it category name. So I'm going to grab that category name. Then I'll use the ampersand operator. I can write text by putting it in double quotes in my DAX. And then subcategory name. Zoom back out. We've got a new column then that we can see category and subcategory have been concatenated into a new column. So we can use DAX as well to work with the text in our data model, not just aggregations. Okay. We good to do a couple more demos, or do we need to land the plane?
Well, how much more? I mean, yeah, we're right at the top of the hour, so it's just been a little over an hour.
Okay.
I would say, if people are still interested, maybe another demo or so, and
okay. Okay.
It's fine by me.
Okay. Sounds good.
So can you demo using the DAX tab there on the left? No, you've been using like add a new measure and then you do it on the top bar, but there's a DAX panel or something that gets opened on the left under the model.
Oh, the DAX query, that's probably a little beyond our scope for tonight. That would actually, that's more of like you're probably not writing DAX queries till like level 400.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought that was just like a tool to write DAX, like DAX Studio or something like that.
It's similar. Yeah, it's a way that we can write DAX queries against our model, but it gets a little more advanced than what I've got prepared for this talk. But something I'd be happy to show you after we're done.
I think I've done a demo on this, and maybe I could schedule it into this group again. I could resurrect that.
Oh yeah,
the DAX query view.
Yeah, sounds good. So one more measure, and I want to use calculate this time. So calculate is, as I mentioned, like the Swiss Army knife. And when you read the IntelliSense or the or the simple definition they give us here, it almost is oversimplified for what calculate is and what it can do. So it evaluates an expression in a context modified by filters. Don't always think that explains as well what's going on, but calculate gets used all the time in Power BI. I mean, once you write more than just one basic aggregation, you're going to be writing calculates all over the place. And Mark and I put together a kind of a 200 level course or a 200 level talk. We'll spend at least an hour just talking about what calculate is and what it does. But I want to help you get a bit of a feel for that here real quick tonight. So to do that, let's write a quick measure here that shows us the number of customers that have had sales over $1,000. So in order to do that, we need to know, one, how many customers we have. Easy way to do that is to count the distinct number of customer keys from our sales table. And then, following our IntelliSense, we can actually, inside of this calculate, we're going to apply a filter or hard code a filter in to our DAX measure here. The way that we do that is just the same way as we've been writing DAX already. So there we go. So my fingers will cooperate here. All right, so what's happening here? We are counting the distinct number of customers from our sales table. And then we're applying this filter, but only count them if that sales amount, so there is over 1,000. So I guess in this case, it's really if they've made purchases or purchased items over $1,000. So we do this. If I bring that over, we see there is 83,000 customers. And just to show difference, let me create playing with this model earlier, and apparently, yeah. So we filtered down our result. So there were 88,000 distinct customers in that sales table, and 83,000 of them have a record in that fact table over $1,000. So what Calculate allows us to do then is to take these simple measures, start applying some filters. So this is where we start to get into more complex calculations. They certainly can get a lot more complex than this, and allows us to start implementing that business logic within our calculations in Power BI or within our other data models. So let me give you a couple more tips and we will land this plane. A couple of things I think we've already covered pretty well tonight. You may want to consider a metrics table to keep your measures organized. As we talked about a couple minutes ago, there's more than one way of accomplishing that, but it's something to consider which path is right for you. DAX can include comments as well. So if you're used to writing comments in your SQL or your Python or any other languages that you may have coded in, DAX will accept those comments as well. Highly recommend that you document your DAX with comments. Format your DAX to keep it readable. As your DAX measures grow, or you start writing DAX queries and they get large, use DAX Formatter. It's a free tool from the folks at SQL BI, daxformatter.com. You can copy and paste your code in and get a nice, clean, easy to read version of your DAX. And then don't forget to apply formatting to your DAX measures. Add those currency symbols and decimal places and thousand separators, and format them well to make the life easier of your report consumers. So with that, that's what I got for you guys tonight. Happy to answer any more questions that you may have or clarify anything that might be fuzzy.
a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear
Yeah.
you.
Well, my question is, I'm curious about the performance impact
Hmm.
by the DAX queries. I
Hmm.
have seen some workbooks with a lot of those DAX queries,
Hmm.
measures and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
You know, to execute those queries, it takes compute resources. You
Hmm.
know, I wonder what the balance of, you know, what need to be done better done on the data side versus you do it using DAX. You know, the whatever Power BI, Tableau, they're visualization tools. They're
Hmm.
not meant for data.
Hmm.
So I want to get your opinion on that. What's enough? What's enough? You know? Yeah.
I think, well, I think there's a couple of different answers. A, keep your models clean and lean. So, um, and keep your reports clean and lean. So you don't want to have visuals on your report pages that aren't useful. So getting rid of those, then anytime somebody interacts with your report, you're lessening the amount of compute needed uh, for those visuals to render. Um, but actually, you can use that third-party tool DAX Studio. There is a bunch of performance tools to help you within DAX Studio to optimize either your DAX queries or your DAX measures. It'll show you what's going on in the storage engine and the DAX engine under the hood, and show you where your DAX measures might might need some performance tuning. Um, if you don't need something quite that heavy, you can use the performance analyzer here in Power BI. Um, and when you turn this on and click refresh visuals, it's actually going to refresh every visual on your page, show you how long it took to refresh, and help you to understand, all right, is my problem here? These refresh so fast that we don't have a great example, but it's going to show you. All right, the DAX that is written, it took 8 milliseconds in the matrix visual to return my answer. So it actually took longer for the visual itself to render than it did for the DAX to come up with the answer. But as your measures get more complex, you'll see that number grow, and um, you can see then how Power BI is actually executing that DAX and be able to performance tune it.
Yeah, and I think I kind of interpreted the question a little bit differently, right? Is I mean, number one, you're not going to be able to do Power BI reports without having measures, because measures are the
True.
values that show up on the visualizations. So it's writing the measures efficiently, and as was kind of stated there, right? In order to have efficient measures, you need to have an efficient model. And comparing the way Tableau does things to Power BI, Tableau likes to work with one big table. You do a lot of things
Mm-hmm.
outside of Tableau itself to get it there. Um, Power BI prefers the star schema,
That's
the
right.
facts and dimensions. So that's number one if you're trying to compare the two. Um, and then, like Michael said, is once you have a DAX measure, right? So if you have a simplified model, you're going to have simplified measures, right? If you keep it over to sum, average, whatever, right? But you may have that logic, like he said, and you're going to have to say, sales something over $1,000, right? Um, and that's a very good example of when you're kind of hard coding something in there, but you may have things that somebody puts in a range of values or
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Your measure handles it. So you got to performance test them all the time.
Yep.
But this is a great introduction to a lot of what, like you were showing the 100s and the 200s. The more you stay in that, the better off you're going to be on performance. And if you get your model straight to do that, you'd be better off. Does
Yeah.
that help, Don?
Yes, yeah, for sure. You know, what I find out the challenger is I like the DAX. It's just super powerful. It's probably a lot more powerful than Tableau calculated field. Not even compare. But there's situations that to get to the data model of the Power BI requires sometimes can be challenging and depends on your data, where your data come from, how do you manipulate it, and then you need to separate the data into a different like a star schema. That alone could really take some significant effort to get to that point. So sometimes there may be a big table just to get what you want. It look at the overall effort. It's simpler, but like I love Power BI. I think it's just it's easier to build some very impactful business report right off the bat. Yeah.
I have one last question, please.
Sure.
On the on the DAX, I want to find the full help on calculation. I press the F1 key and it doesn't take me to help. So how do I jump to like the help page from Power BI at any point to see description or information about whatever context I've selected?
Gotcha. I don't
know. I'm not sure that there is one.
I don't know either. The way I usually like to do it is
Go to your favorite search engine,
yep.
and when you get to Bing, type in DAX
DAX guide.
or just type DAX space guide and then the function, and then now Michael could show from there. This is the best help for learning the DAX language, or knowing what
Absolutely.
a function does.
So I usually have it in two different windows, but it's something like this, where I'll have my report going on here on the left. I'm writing DAX over here, and then I'm scrolling through this column to find whatever particular function that I'm working with, and bouncing back and forth between the two.
And it's a great spot to learn like what the different contexts are, because you can scroll to the top of that thing and see all the functions that relate to filter context, or all the iterators, or everything related to row context. It's kind of neat to be able to compartmentalize these functions into those contexts.
That's right. That's right. So, yep. There's a lot of them here.
So. And sometimes I will still end up on the Microsoft site with it, but
yep.
Normally this is going to answer my question first.
That's right. Yep. Agreed. Cool. Any other questions?
Fernando has one in the chat.
Okay.
And it just says, do you deliver to Mexico? So I'm assuming I'm assuming he's asking, like, could you deliver training? Fernando, do you want to come off mute?
Fernando, the answer is yes.
Yes, it is. Yes.
We do deliver to Mexico.
So. Yes.
0 tariffs.
That's right.
Pizza.
Oh, do you deliver pizza? Oh, the pizza that he works at.
Okay. That one, we do not have any locations. I mean, we've got over 10,000 locations now, but we don't have any south of the border.
10,000, no. But DAX too. The other day, Marco was presenting in a user group. I don't remember which. And I said, "Hi, friend." He asked, "Where are you coming to see the training?" And I said, "Mexico." And we are still waiting for you to come. And he wrote, "Yes, I need to go to South America and Central America. Mexico is in North America, but never mind." But yes, we need to organize some serious DAX training course here in Mexico.
If he shows up, you need to go. That's
Yes.
just
No,
it.
I will host it.
Yes.
Nice.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds great.
Great session, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you,
Yes.
Michael.
Thank you all.
Well, I'm
Thank you.
gonna
You
go,
guys had
great.
great
go ahead and
questions
turn off the
tonight. Thank you.
recording. So we'll stop the recording.